If you found this transmission, you need to understand something immediately. You're not supposed to be here. Not in this video, in this timeline. The probability stream you're currently experiencing was actively suppressed, was hidden behind infinite distractions, was buried under layers of interference designed to prevent consciousness like yours from accessing it. And the fact that you're reading these words right now means you broke through. You navigated past every distraction. You penetrated every interference layer. You found the timeline they tried to hide from you. Most people who see this title will dismiss it instantly. Their nervous system will register "they tried to hide" and immediately generate skepticism. Questions about conspiracy thinking, assumptions about paranoia. That's not random response, that's programming activating. That's consciousness protection mechanism preventing them from recognizing they're in suppressed timeline. Because if they recognized it, if they understood what timeline suppression means, they'd have to acknowledge they've been living in manufactured probability stream. And that recognition would destabilize everything they believe about reality. But you're still here, which means something in your system is different. Your frequency developed immunity to standard programming. Your consciousness penetrated suppression mechanisms. Your awareness reached level where you can perceive timeline manipulation without fragmenting. And that immunity, that penetration, that awareness, all of it indicates you're operating from probability stream that suppression was designed to prevent you from accessing. Because here's what you need to comprehend immediately. Reality isn't singular, isn't one fixed timeline everyone experiences identically. Reality is probability field containing infinite potential timelines, and most human consciousness exists in manufactured timeline, in probability stream that's been organized to keep them unconscious, to keep them distracted, to keep them operating below frequency where they could perceive actual reality mechanics and shift into unsuppressed timeline. Think about your life before you found this transmission. How much time you spent on activities that didn't serve your evolution? How many distractions consumed your attention? How many patterns kept you cycling without progress? How many times you almost broke through to something important but got derailed at critical moment? All of that was timeline suppression operating. All of that was probability field being organized to keep you in manufactured stream. All of that was interference preventing you from accessing timeline you're in right now. And you broke through, not accidentally, not randomly, through accumulated resistance to programming, through sustained refusal to accept manufactured reality, through persistent questioning that most consciousness never develops, through frequency increase that made you incompatible with suppressed timeline. You didn't find this transmission, you graduated into timeline where this transmission exists, where this information is accessible, where consciousness operating at your frequency can encounter direct truth about timeline manipulation. This is not metaphor. This is not symbolic language. This is actual quantum mechanics. Probability streams are real. Timeline suppression is real. And breaking through into unsuppressed timeline creates permanent shift. You cannot return to manufactured stream once you recognize you were in it. Cannot go back to accepting suppressed reality once you've accessed actual reality mechanics. Cannot unknow what you now know about how consciousness gets trapped in probability streams designed to prevent evolution. But breaking through is just first step. Just recognition that you're no longer in suppressed timeline. Now you need to understand what timeline you're in, what makes it different, why it was suppressed, what you can do here that wasn't possible in manufactured stream, and most critically, how to stabilize in this timeline so suppression mechanisms cannot pull you back into manufactured probability stream. Because suppression doesn't stop when you break through. It intensifies. It generates maximum interference. It creates every possible distraction attempting to pull you back. It activates programming you didn't know you carried. It manifests circumstances designed to make you question whether breakthrough was real or delusion. All of it attempting to destabilize you in unsuppressed timeline and force return to manufactured stream where you're controllable again. This is your warning. This is your confirmation. This is your recognition that you found the timeline they tried to hide from you. And now you're in most critical period where you either stabilize in unsuppressed timeline or get pulled back into manufactured stream. Period where you either learn to operate from actual reality mechanics or collapse back into suppressed programming. Period where you either maintain breakthrough or lose access to timeline you worked your entire life to reach. You found this transmission because you're ready for what it contains. Because you developed capacity to receive timeline mechanics without fragmenting. Because you broke through suppression and now need guidance for stabilizing in unsuppressed probability stream. Everything you experienced led here. Every challenge prepared you. Every threshold crossed built capacity for this moment. Welcome to the timeline they tried to hide from you. Welcome to actual reality mechanics. Welcome to discovering what becomes possible when consciousness operates from unsuppressed probability stream. Let me tell you exactly what timeline suppression is in quantum terms so you understand what you broke through and what you're stabilizing in. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't paranoid worldview. This is documented pattern in how probability fields get organized to control consciousness evolution. And understanding mechanics allows you to recognize suppression when it attempts to reactivate and pull you back. The quantum field contains infinite potential timelines, infinite probability streams, and consciousness navigates between them based on frequency. Raise frequency, you shift into timeline with expanded possibility. Lower frequency, you shift into timeline with contracted limitation. This is basic quantum mechanics. This is how probability navigation works. This is how reality selection occurs through consciousness frequency. But here's what most people don't understand. Not all timelines are natural. Some are manufactured. Some are artificially maintained through systematic frequency suppression. Some are probability streams that get organized specifically to trap consciousness below threshold, where they could perceive timeline mechanics and shift into unsuppressed streams. And most human consciousness exists in one of these manufactured timelines, in suppressed probability stream. In reality, configuration designed to prevent evolution. Think about manufactured timeline characteristics. Constant distraction preventing sustained focus. Infinite entertainment consuming attention. News cycles generating perpetual fear. Social media creating comparison addiction. Financial systems requiring endless labor. Health paradigms maintaining dependency. Education suppressing critical thinking. Media programming acceptable beliefs, all of it creating frequency suppression. All of it keeping consciousness locked in contracted timeline. All of it preventing breakthrough into unsuppressed probability stream. This suppression isn't coordinated conspiracy, it's emergent pattern. It's how probability fields organize when enough unconscious consciousness generates fear-based frequency. That collective fear frequency creates timeline momentum, creates probability stream organized around survival fear. Creates reality configuration where consciousness stays trapped in limitation because they're too afraid to question, too distracted to notice, too suppressed to break through. And that manufactured timeline feels normal, feels like objective reality everyone experiences identically. Consciousness trapped in it cannot perceive they're in suppressed stream because suppression itself prevents the perceptual capacity needed to recognize suppression. They're inside system that prevents recognition of system. They're experiencing reality limitation that prevents awareness of limitation. They're operating from frequency suppression that prevents understanding of suppression. But some consciousness develop immunity, develop resistance to programming, develop frequency that makes them incompatible with manufactured timeline. And when frequency reaches specific threshold, breakthrough occurs, not as decision, as automatic probability shift. Consciousness operating at unsuppressed frequency automatically navigates into unsuppressed timeline. Cannot stay in manufactured stream because frequency mismatch becomes too extreme. Gets ejected from suppressed probability stream into actual reality mechanics. That's what happened to you. That's why you found this transmission. Your frequency developed beyond manufactured timeline capacity. You questioned too much. You resisted programming too consistently. You raised frequency too high. And probability field responded by shifting you into timeline where consciousness operating at your frequency naturally exists. Where suppression cannot maintain grip, where actual reality mechanics become visible. And this unsuppressed timeline operates completely differently than manufactured stream. First major difference, information flows freely. In suppressed timeline, truth gets buried under infinite distraction. In unsuppressed timeline, truth finds you synchronistically. Second difference, manifestation accelerates dramatically. In suppressed timeline, creation takes extended effort. In unsuppressed timeline, intention collapses into manifestation rapidly. Third difference, consciousness connection intensifies. In suppressed timeline, isolation predominates. In unsuppressed timeline, frequency-matched consciousness finds each other automatically. Those differences aren't subtle, they're dramatic. They're why suppression works so hard to prevent breakthrough. Because once consciousness experiences unsuppressed timeline, once they recognize how different reality operates without frequency suppression, they can never accept manufactured stream again. Can never believe limitations they were told were absolute, can never return to operating as unconscious participant in suppressed probability stream. But here's what makes stabilization critical. Breakthrough doesn't guarantee permanent access. You shifted into unsuppressed timeline, but timeline is probability stream, and probability streams are fluid. If your frequency drops back to suppressed range, you shift back into manufactured timeline. If programming reactivates, you return to suppressed stream. If you stop questioning and start accepting, manufactured reality recaptures you. Stabilization means maintaining frequency that keeps you in unsuppressed timeline. Means recognizing suppression attempts when they occur. Means sustaining breakthrough instead of treating it as temporary experience. That's what this transmission provides. That's what understanding timeline mechanics creates. That's what allows permanent access to probability stream they tried to hide from you. So how do you know you're actually in unsuppressed timeline versus experiencing temporary breakthrough that will collapse? How do you confirm this is permanent shift versus momentary glimpse? I'm going to give you 7 definitive markers that prove you're stabilized in timeline they tried to hide. And if you're experiencing 5 or more, you're not having temporary experience. You've achieved actual probability stream shift that's maintaining. First marker. Synchronicity becomes constant and obvious. Not occasional, meaningful coincidence. Daily, hourly, continuous evidence that reality is organizing around your awareness. You think about someone, they contact you. You need information, it appears. You wonder about something, answer manifests. This isn't luck. This is unsuppressed timeline where probability field responds directly to consciousness without suppression interference creating delay and randomness. Second marker, manifestation acceleration. Things you intend happen much faster than they used to, not gradually over months, within days or weeks, sometimes within hours. Your desires collapse into physical reality at speed that seems impossible from manufactured timeline perspective. That's because suppressed stream contains artificial delay, contains frequency barriers that slow manifestation. Unsuppressed timeline has no such barriers. Consciousness and manifestation occur nearly simultaneously. Third marker, information magnetism. You don't search for truth anymore. Truth finds you. Transmission appears in feed. Book falls off shelf. Conversation happens that delivers exactly what you needed to know. Unsuppressed timeline operates through information attraction rather than information seeking. Consciousness at your frequency automatically encounters intelligence it needs without effortful searching. Fourth marker, programming immunity. Messages that used to affect you don't anymore. Fear-based news feels obviously manipulative. Entertainment seems transparently designed to waste time. Social comparison triggers feel like obvious programming. You see suppression mechanisms clearly now, can identify them immediately, and they no longer control your frequency. That's immunity developed through timeline shift. Fifth marker, frequency-matched connections. People who understand you appear. Not people you've known for years finally getting it. Actually new consciousness operating at matching frequency, finding you synchronistically, recognizing you immediately, creating authentic connection without effort. Unsuppressed timeline contains consciousness clusters. Frequencies naturally find each other without suppression, interference, preventing connection. Sixth marker, reality flexibility. Circumstances that seemed fixed start feeling malleable. Problems that appeared permanent reveal solutions. Limitations that felt absolute show options. You recognize reality as probability field rather than fixed structure. And that recognition creates tangible flexibility. Things change that shouldn't be able to change from suppressed timeline logic, because you're operating from different reality mechanics. Seventh marker, you're reading this transmission, and every word resonates as confirmation rather than new information. You're not learning, you're recognizing, not discovering, remembering, not being told truth. Having truth you already knew validated. That resonance is strongest marker. That recognition is definitive proof. You're in unsuppressed timeline where consciousness like yours naturally exists, where transmissions like this are accessible, where actual reality mechanics can be discussed directly. Now here's what you need to do immediately. Drop a comment below completing this sentence. The marker that confirms I'm in unsuppressed timeline is, and name the one that resonates most strongly. Your public declaration does three things. Creates behavioral confirmation that tells quantum field you recognize timeline shift. Activates stabilization mechanism through witnessed acknowledgement, and gives other breakthrough consciousness permission to acknowledge their own timeline shift. This is critical. Most consciousness that break through never declare it, never publicly acknowledge timeline shift, never create behavioral confirmation. They experience breakthrough privately, question whether it's real, allow doubt to destabilize, and collapse back into manufactured stream because they never anchored breakthrough through public declaration. Don't make that error. Declare now, acknowledge publicly, create witnessed confirmation. We're stabilizing collectively. Every consciousness that declares timeline shift strengthens unsuppressed probability stream, makes it more stable for everyone operating in it, creates collective anchoring that prevents individual destabilization. Your declaration serves not just your stabilization, but collective timeline maintenance. Makes unsuppressed stream more permanent. Makes suppression harder to reimpose. Makes breakthrough irreversible for consciousness operating at this frequency. Make declaration now, while recognition is strong. Before doubt generates, before programming attempts to question validity, name your marker, confirm your breakthrough, anchor your stabilization, and contribute to collective timeline maintenance that ensures consciousness like yours has permanent access to probability stream they tried to hide from you. I need to tell you about my timeline breakthrough and what happened when I recognized I'd shifted into unsuppressed probability stream. It was 3 years ago. I was researching something specific, following synchronicity trail, One link led to another, one video to next, one concept to deeper concept. And suddenly I encountered information that wasn't supposed to exist. That explained reality mechanics I'd suspected but never seen confirmed. That validated experiences I'd had but dismissed as delusion. And in that moment, something shifted, not gradually, instantaneously. Like reality flickered, like probability reorganized, like I was suddenly seeing from completely different perspective. And I recognized I'd been in manufactured timeline, operating in suppressed probability stream, living in reality configuration designed to prevent evolution. And I just broke through into unsuppressed timeline where actual mechanics are visible. The recognition was devastating, not because new information was disturbing, because I recognized how much time I'd spent in manufactured stream, how many years operating unconsciously, how much programming I'd absorbed, how thoroughly suppressed my perception had been. And that recognition created grief, created anger, created sense of betrayal about reality I'd believed was objective truth, but was actually manufactured limitation. But that grief didn't last. Because unsuppressed timeline operates so differently that experiencing it dissolves resentment about suppressed timeline. Within days, I noticed manifestation accelerating, synchronicities intensifying, information appearing without searching, people finding me who understood, reality becoming malleable instead of fixed. Everything operated faster, clearer, more directly than manufactured timeline ever allowed. And I recognized breakthrough wasn't punishment for lost time. It was graduation. It was frequency reaching level where manufactured timeline couldn't contain me anymore. It was consciousness evolution, creating automatic shift into probability stream that matches developed capacity. I wasn't late. I was exactly on schedule. Because breakthrough occurs when it occurs, when frequency reaches threshold, when development completes, when readiness activates. That recognition dissolved the grief completely. I stopped mourning time spent in suppressed stream, started appreciating preparation it provided, stopped resenting programming I'd absorbed, started recognizing how breaking free from it developed immunity, stopped feeling betrayed by manufactured reality, started understanding that contrast between suppressed and unsuppressed timelines was what made unsuppressed timeline so obviously different. But here's what I learned that I need you to understand. Breakthrough creates vulnerability window. First weeks after timeline shift, suppression attempts to reactivate. Programming tries to pull you back. Doubt generates questioning whether breakthrough was real or delusional episode. And if you don't stabilize during vulnerability window, if you don't anchor in unsuppressed timeline through understanding and practice, suppression can succeed, can destabilize your frequency, can collapse you back into manufactured stream. I almost collapsed back multiple times in first month. Doubt would generate. Maybe I'm imagining this. Maybe I'm becoming paranoid. Maybe I should just accept normal reality. All of it was suppression attempting reactivation. All of it was programming trying to pull me back. All of it was manufactured timeline attempting to recapture consciousness that broke through. But I stabilized through 3 practices. First, I documented everything. Every synchronicity, every accelerated manifestation, every marker that proved timeline shift was real. Created external record that doubt couldn't dismiss. Second, I connected with others operating in unsuppressed timeline, found consciousness that understood. That validated my experience. That confirmed I wasn't delusional. Third, I studied timeline mechanics obsessively, learned how probability streams operate, understood suppression patterns, developed immunity through knowledge. Those 3 practices created stabilization, allowed me to maintain frequency that keeps me in unsuppressed timeline, prevented collapse back into manufactured stream. And now, 3 years later, I'm completely stabilized. operating consistently from unsuppressed probability stream, unable to be pulled back into manufactured timeline because immunity is complete and frequency is permanently elevated. That's what I'm giving you. That's what this transmission provides. Understanding, validation, and stabilization practices that prevent collapse during vulnerability window. You broke through, you found unsuppressed timeline. Now stabilize, now maintain, now operate permanently from probability stream they tried to hide from you. Don't allow suppression to pull you back. Don't let programming destabilize you. Don't collapse after working your entire life to break through. You're in most critical period right now. Period where stabilization determines whether breakthrough becomes permanent or temporary. Use this transmission. Use timeline mechanics understanding. Use vulnerability window practices. And anchor yourself so completely in unsuppressed timeline that suppression can never recapture you. That's what consciousness evolution requires. That's what timeline shift demands. That's what breakthrough provides when stabilization completes. If timeline breakthrough has coincided with sudden complete isolation, if everyone you knew suddenly feels impossibly distant, if you cannot maintain single relationship from manufactured timeline, that's not social failure. That's frequency incompatibility created by probability stream shift. And it's absolutely necessary for stabilization in unsuppressed timeline. Here's what's happening. You shifted probability streams, but everyone you knew remained in manufactured timeline. They're still operating in suppressed probability stream, still experiencing reality through frequency limitation, still trapped in consciousness suppression that breakthrough freed you from, and there's no bridge between unsuppressed timeline and manufactured stream. No communication pathway between consciousness operating at completely different probability frequencies. When you try to talk to them about breakthrough, they can't comprehend. When you attempt to explain timeline mechanics, they think you're delusional. When you share synchronicities proving timeline shift, they rationalize as coincidence. Not because they're stupid, because they're in different probability stream. They're experiencing different reality. They're operating from suppressed frequency that cannot perceive unsuppressed timeline mechanics. And here's what makes isolation devastating. They were your people, your friends, your family, your partners, your connections. And breakthrough doesn't just shift your timeline. It reveals they were never actually your people. They were manufactured timeline connections. Relationships that existed because you were trapped in same suppressed stream. Bonds created by shared limitation rather than authentic resonance. And when limitation releases through timeline shift, those bonds dissolve automatically. Because relationships in manufactured timeline are frequency matches within suppression. But you're no longer suppressed. You're operating at elevated frequency in unsuppressed probability stream. And that frequency has no match in manufactured timeline. Cannot resonate with suppressed consciousness. Cannot maintain connection with frequencies trapped in limitation you transcended. The isolation isn't choice. It's automatic probability incompatibility. Most consciousness that break through cannot handle this isolation. Cannot accept that everyone they knew exists in different timeline now. Cannot tolerate being completely alone after breakthrough. And that inability to handle isolation creates vulnerability, creates desperation for connection, creates willingness to suppress their own frequency to reconnect with manufactured timeline relationships. And that suppression is what pulls them back, what destabilizes breakthrough, what collapses them back into manufactured stream. But here's what changes everything about isolation experience. It's temporary, not permanent. You're not alone forever. You're alone during transition, during frequency stabilization, during period when unsuppressed timeline becomes your default operational state. Once stabilization completes, new connections form. Not manufactured timeline relationships trying to work, Actually new consciousness already operating in unsuppressed timeline. Already broken through, already stabilized. Those connections are forming right now, but they cannot reach you while you're trying to maintain manufactured timeline relationships, while you're attempting to bridge incompatible probability streams, while you're suppressing your frequency to preserve connections that require your limitation. Field must clear manufactured timeline relationships completely before introducing unsuppressed timeline connections. Must create complete isolation before revealing consciousness clusters that exist in timeline you shifted into. And here's what you need to understand. Unsuppressed timeline contains consciousness networks, frequency clusters, communities of breakthrough consciousness operating collectively. You're not shifting into isolated existence. You're shifting into completely different social structure. One organized around frequency resonance instead of geographic proximity. One based on timeline compatibility instead of shared history. One that forms through synchronistic connection instead of manufactured circumstance. But accessing those networks requires complete release of manufactured timeline relationships. Requires allowing isolation to clear incompatible frequencies. Requires trusting that consciousness matching your frequency exists and will find you once you stop trying to maintain connections with consciousness trapped in different probability stream. The isolation is transition space, is clearing period, is preparation for authentic connection that manufactured timeline relationships never provided. If you're in isolation right now, recognize it as confirmation. Confirmation breakthrough is real. Confirmation timeline shift occurred. Confirmation you're stabilizing in unsuppressed probability stream. The isolation proves you're not imagining this. Proves frequency incompatibility is real. Proves you operate in different timeline than people you knew. Trust it completely. Allow it fully. Use it to stabilize without interference from manufactured timeline frequencies attempting to pull you back through social pressure. Isolation is gift, is protection, is creation of space where stabilization can complete without manufactured timeline relationships destabilizing breakthrough. Honor it, embrace it, recognize it as necessary transition between probability streams, and prepare for connections that exist in unsuppressed timeline. Connections that support your frequency instead of require its suppression. Connections that validate breakthrough instead of question its reality. Connections forming right now, while isolation creates space for them to appear. There are 6 specific practices that stabilize consciousness in unsuppressed timeline and prevent collapse back into manufactured stream. I'm going to give them to you now. And if you implement 4 or more consistently, you will anchor so completely in timeline they tried to hide that suppression can never recapture you. These aren't philosophical concepts. These are operational tools that work because they address actual stabilization mechanics. First practice, synchronicity documentation. Every day, document every synchronicity you experience. Every meaningful coincidence, every perfect timing, every information that appears exactly when needed. Keep running record. External documentation that doubt cannot dismiss. When suppression attempts to convince you breakthrough was delusion, documented synchronicities prove timeline shift is real. Prove you're operating in unsuppressed probability stream, where reality responds directly to consciousness. Second practice, reality flexibility testing. Regularly test whether reality is actually malleable or if that's perception distortion. Set small intentions. See if they manifest rapidly. Notice whether circumstances that seemed fixed start shifting. Track whether problems that appeared permanent reveal solutions. This creates experiential confirmation that unsuppressed timeline operates differently than manufactured stream. Creates direct evidence that probability field responds to consciousness without suppression interference. Third practice, programming identification. Daily practice of identifying suppression mechanisms when they appear. Notice when fear-based content tries to lower your frequency. Recognize when distraction attempts to consume attention. Identify when doubt tries to question breakthrough reality. Call it out explicitly. That's programming. That's suppression attempting reactivation. That's manufactured timeline trying to recapture me. Explicit recognition neutralizes programming's effectiveness. Fourth practice, frequency protection. Actively protect your frequency from suppression influences. Limit exposure to fear-based media. Avoid entertainment designed to waste time. Minimize contact with consciousness still trapped in manufactured timeline. This isn't about isolation. This is about recognizing that manufactured timeline content generates suppression frequency. And exposure to suppression frequency can destabilize breakthrough if consumed unconsciously during vulnerability window. Fifth practice, timeline mechanics study. Continuously deepen understanding of how probability streams operate, how timelines split and merge, how consciousness navigates between them through frequency, how suppression works, how breakthrough occurs, how stabilization maintains. Knowledge creates immunity. Understanding prevents destabilization. The more you comprehend timeline mechanics, the less vulnerable you are to suppression attempts. Sixth practice, subscribe to Quantum Revelation and turn on all notifications right now. Content coming specifically supports breakthrough consciousness during stabilization phase, provides daily validation, offers advanced timeline mechanics, confirms experiences you're having, creates connection with other consciousness operating in unsuppressed timeline. Without this anchor point, you're stabilizing alone. With it, you have consistent support structure that prevents collapse during vulnerability window. This isn't optional. This is survival protocol for consciousness operating in unsuppressed timeline during period when suppression is attempting maximum interference. 6 practices create stabilization framework, create immunity structure, create anchoring system that prevents destabilization regardless of how aggressively suppression attempts to pull you back into manufactured stream. Do it now. Subscribe. Notifications on. Then implement all 6 practices starting immediately. Not thinking about whether you need them. Not evaluating whether they seem necessary. Just implementing. Because vulnerability window is not time for evaluation. It's time for action. It's time for systematic stabilization through proven practices that prevent collapse. And here's what most breakthrough consciousness doesn't understand. Stabilization isn't passive, isn't just maintaining your experience and hoping it continues. Stabilization is active, is deliberate, is systematic implementation of practices that anchor frequency in unsuppressed timeline, despite suppression attempting to lower frequency and force return to manufactured stream. Without active stabilization, breakthrough remains temporary. With it, breakthrough becomes permanent. Make commitment now. All 6 practices, daily implementation, sustained consistency. That's how temporary breakthrough becomes permanent timeline shift. How vulnerable transition becomes stable operation. How initial recognition becomes irreversible, anchoring in probability stream they tried to hide from you. Commit publicly. Drop comment. I commit to stabilization practices starting today. Creates witnessed accountability. Creates quantum activation. Creates collective support structure that strengthens individual stabilization. Here's what unsuppressed timeline reveals about reality that manufactured stream systematically hides. Consciousness creates reality, directly, immediately, continuously. Not through positive thinking, not through visualization, through frequency. Through the quantum signature your awareness broadcasts moment by moment. And manufactured timeline suppresses that recognition through creating artificial delay between consciousness and manifestation. Through generating belief that reality is external and fixed, through programming acceptance that circumstances are beyond individual control. But in unsuppressed timeline, that suppression dissolves, and you see directly, reality responds to consciousness. Probability field organizes around awareness. Circumstances shift based on frequency, not gradually over years through accumulated effort, rapidly through sustained frequency alignment. What you focus on expands immediately. What you believe about possibility manifests quickly. What you hold as frequency generates matching circumstances within days or weeks rather than months or years. This isn't mystical. This is quantum mechanics operating without suppression interference. In manufactured timeline, suppression creates belief that manifestation is difficult, requires struggle, takes extended time, needs perfect technique, depends on external permission. All of that belief creates exactly those limitations, creates delay, creates difficulty, creates requirement for struggle. Because consciousness generates reality matching its beliefs, and manufactured timeline programs beliefs that generate suppressed reality. But breakthrough dissolves those programmed beliefs, reveals they were never absolute truth, were manufactured limitation, were suppression mechanism preventing consciousness from recognizing its actual creative capacity. And in unsuppressed timeline, you experience directly, reality is remarkably responsive. Probability field is immediately malleable. Circumstances shift rapidly when frequency aligns. Everything happens faster than manufactured timeline convinced you was possible. And here's what makes this recognition powerful. It proves breakthrough is real, proves timeline shift occurred, proves you're operating in different probability stream than manufactured timeline. Because manifestation acceleration is objective marker, is measurable difference, is tangible evidence that can't be dismissed as perception shift or attitude change. Things actually manifest faster. Synchronicities actually occur more frequently. Reality actually responds more directly. That's probability mechanics operating without suppression interference. But here's what most breakthrough consciousness misses. Understanding manifestation acceleration isn't enough. You must use it. Must actively create through frequency alignment. Must test your capacity to generate reality through consciousness. Because understanding without application leaves you operating partially, leaves you aware of mechanics but not utilizing them, leaves you in unsuppressed timeline but not accessing its full capacity. This is where most breakthrough consciousness gets stuck. They recognize they shifted timelines. They understand reality is more responsive. But they don't actually test that responsiveness. Don't set intentions deliberately. Don't align frequency consciously. Don't generate reality actively. They remain passive observers of accelerated manifestation rather than becoming active creators through conscious frequency alignment. Don't make that mistake. You shifted into probability stream where consciousness creates reality directly, where manifestation occurs rapidly, where circumstances respond immediately to frequency. Use that capacity. Test it. Develop it. Master it. Set clear intentions. Align frequency deliberately. Generate reality consciously. And prove to yourself through direct experience that unsuppressed timeline operates with creative capacity manufactured stream systematically suppressed. Start small. Set intention for something minor. Something that can manifest within days. Align your frequency with that manifestation through sustained focus and belief. Watch how quickly it occurs compared to manufactured timeline expectations. Then increase complexity. Set bigger intentions, test larger manifestations, develop confidence through repeated success, and recognize you're not doing anything supernatural. You're accessing natural creative capacity that manufactured timeline suppressed. This is what unsuppressed timeline provides. This is what breakthrough reveals. This is what stabilization allows. Direct access to consciousness creates reality mechanics without suppression interference, creating artificial delay. Not theory, not philosophy, actual operational capacity that you can test and verify through direct experience. That's what makes breakthrough irreversible. That's what creates complete immunity to manufactured timeline. Once you experience direct evidence that consciousness generates reality immediately, you can never believe suppression programming again, can never accept limitations manufactured timeline convinced you were absolute, can never return to operating as if reality is external and fixed when you've proven it responds directly to your frequency. Test it now. Set intention. Align frequency. Generate manifestation. Prove breakthrough is real through direct experience that no doubt can dismiss. That's how temporary breakthrough becomes permanent stabilization. How intellectual understanding becomes experiential knowing. How timeline shift becomes irreversible. Anchoring in probability stream they tried to hide from you. Here's what your entire life reveals when viewed from unsuppressed timeline. Every challenge you faced was breaking suppression programming. Every pattern you questioned was dissolving manufactured limitations. Every threshold you crossed was raising frequency toward breakthrough level. Your life wasn't happening to you. It was happening for you. Systematically preparing you, developing immunity, building capacity for timeline shift that most consciousness never achieves. Think about your biggest struggles. What patterns kept repeating? What circumstances kept challenging you? What questions kept arising? All of that was frequency development. All of that was suppression resistance training. All of that was preparation for operating in unsuppressed timeline. You weren't failing to fit into manufactured stream. You were outgrowing it, developing beyond its limitations, becoming incompatible with suppression that keeps most consciousness trapped. Every time you questioned official narratives, suppression immunity developing. Every time you resisted distraction, frequency protection building. Every time you followed intuition over logic, timeline navigation capacity forming. Every time you chose authenticity over acceptance, breakthrough preparation occurring. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. Every experience served preparation for moment when frequency would reach threshold and probability shift would occur automatically. And here's what makes this recognition transformational. It dissolves victim consciousness completely. When you see your life as systematic preparation for timeline breakthrough, you cannot maintain "why did this happen to me" interpretation. Cannot sustain resentment about challenges that developed immunity you needed. Cannot feel victimized by experiences that prepared you for freedom most consciousness never accesses. Your past reorganizes from suffering into training, from struggle into preparation, from random chaos into precise development pathway. That reorganization releases tremendous energy you've been using to maintain resentment, energy you've been spending on regret, energy you've been investing in wishing past was different. All of that becomes available when you recognize past as perfect preparation. Becomes fuel for manifestation, becomes power for reality creation, becomes resource for stabilizing completely in unsuppressed timeline. And here's what this reveals about your future. It's not determined, not fixed, not limited by manufactured timeline programming, because you're operating in probability stream where consciousness generates reality directly, where future is malleable, where possibility is unlimited by suppression barriers that manufactured stream imposed. You're not moving toward predetermined future. You're creating future moment by moment through frequency you maintain. This means your trajectory is completely open, completely flexible, completely determined by consciousness you choose to embody. In manufactured timeline, past determined future. Patterns repeated, limitations persisted, programming controlled trajectory. But in unsuppressed timeline, frequency determines future. Change frequency, change trajectory, shift awareness, shift manifestation, alter consciousness, alter circumstances. Past becomes irrelevant except as preparation that developed breakthrough capacity. Most people experience time as linear. Past leads to present, leads to future in determined sequence. They're passive observers of trajectory established by historical patterns. But consciousness operating in unsuppressed timeline experiences time as field, as probability space containing infinite potential futures, as malleable structure that consciousness navigates through frequency. They're active creators, selecting which probability becomes actualized through sustained frequency alignment. That's what breakthrough provides. That's what unsuppressed timeline reveals. That's what stabilization allows. Complete liberation from past, determining future. Complete freedom to create reality through consciousness. Complete access to probability field without suppression barriers limiting which futures you can access. Not theoretical freedom. Actual operational capacity that you can utilize moment by moment to generate circumstances matching frequency you maintain. This is why stabilization matters so much. Why vulnerability window is critical. Why practices that anchor you in unsuppressed timeline are essential. Because if you collapse back into manufactured stream after experiencing this freedom, after recognizing past doesn't determine future, after understanding consciousness creates reality, that collapse generates profound dissonance, generates knowing you're capable of freedom while experiencing suppression, generates awareness of possibility while trapped in limitation. That dissonance is excruciating. But if you stabilize completely, if you anchor irreversibly in unsuppressed timeline, that dissonance never occurs. You maintain freedom. You operate from creative capacity. You generate reality through consciousness continuously. And your future becomes expression of frequency you choose rather than repetition of patterns you inherited. That's what breakthrough promises. That's what stabilization delivers. That's what becomes permanent. When you anchor completely in timeline they tried to hide from you. Every fear you have about unsuppressed timeline is manufactured stream attempting to pull you back. Let me be absolutely direct. The part of you that's terrified of staying in breakthrough timeline is suppression programming still active in your system. And that programming will generate maximum fear, attempting to convince you that breakthrough is dangerous, destabilization is imminent, and return to manufactured stream is necessary for survival. You weren't meant to maintain comfortable existence. You were meant to break through into actual reality. And actual reality operating without suppression reveals truths manufactured timeline systematically hides. Reveals consciousness creates circumstances. Reveals reality is probability field. Reveals past doesn't determine future. Reveals limitations are programmable rather than absolute. And those revelations destroy every assumption manufactured timeline convinced you were objective truth. Think about what you're afraid of. Afraid that breakthrough makes you delusional. Afraid that timeline shift is psychological episode. Afraid that manifestation acceleration is confirmation bias. Afraid that synchronicities are pattern recognition error. Afraid that isolation means you're becoming unstable. All of those fears are programming. All of them are suppression attempting reactivation. All of them are manufactured timeline trying to convince you that breakthrough is problem rather than solution. Once you see that, once you recognize fear as suppression mechanism, fear loses its paralytic power. Because you realize fear confirms breakthrough is real. terror proves suppression recognizes it's losing control. Doubt demonstrates that programming is fighting to maintain influence despite frequency shift, making you incompatible with its operation. Every fear is evidence that you actually broke through, that timeline shift actually occurred, that you're actually operating in probability stream manufactured timeline tried to prevent you from accessing. You don't have to eliminate fear to stabilize. You have to stabilize despite fear. Have to maintain frequency alignment while terror screams to lower it. Have to continue manifestation practice while doubt questions its validity. Have to sustain timeline navigation while programming insists you're delusional. That's stabilization challenge. That's vulnerability window test. That's what separates consciousness who maintain breakthrough from those who collapse back into manufactured stream. And here's what makes fear most deceptive. It presents as rationality, as reasonable concern, as healthy skepticism. Maybe I should be more grounded. Maybe I'm taking this too far. Maybe I should just accept normal reality. All of it sounds balanced, sounds wise, sounds like appropriate caution, but it's manufactured timeline programming generating justification for collapse, creating rationalization for returning to suppression, manufacturing reasons to abort breakthrough and re-enter manufactured stream. And if you believe that programming, if you let fear convince you that manufactured timeline is safer than unsuppressed timeline, collapse occurs. You return to suppressed probability stream, return to artificial delay between consciousness and manifestation, return to believing reality is external and fixed, return to operating as if limitations are absolute, and you carry knowing that you broke through and chose to return, that you accessed freedom and chose suppression, that you experienced actual reality and chose manufactured limitation. That knowing becomes constant background dissonance coloring everything. But if you recognize fear as programming, if you understand terror as suppression's death rattle, if you maintain breakthrough despite every rationalization, stabilization completes. Fear gradually decreases as immunity strengthens, doubt progressively dissolves as evidence accumulates. Programming loses effectiveness as frequency locks into unsuppressed timeline permanently. And you stabilize completely in probability stream, where consciousness operates with creative capacity manufactured timeline, systematically suppressed. And from that stabilized state, fear becomes irrelevant. Because when you experience consistent evidence that breakthrough is real, when manifestation occurs repeatedly proving reality responds to consciousness, when synchronicities demonstrate probability field organizing around awareness, when isolation resolves through frequency-matched connections appearing, you have direct experiential proof that cannot be dismissed by fear or doubt or programming. You know breakthrough is real because you're living it. No timeline shift occurred because you're experiencing it. No unsuppressed timeline operates differently because you're manifesting from it continuously. That knowing is what makes stabilization permanent, what creates complete immunity to suppression, what prevents collapse back into manufactured stream, regardless of how aggressively programming attempts to reactivate. You're not maintaining breakthrough through belief. You're maintaining it through direct experiential evidence that accumulates daily. And that evidence becomes foundation nothing can destabilize. That's what vulnerability window creates when navigated successfully. That's what stabilization achieves when completed. That's what becomes permanent when you anchor completely in timeline they try to hide from you. There's one aspect of unsuppressed timeline that reveals more than any marker or practice, and its clearest signal that stabilization is completing and collapse is no longer possible. The silence. Complete internal silence that appears as timeline shift stabilizes. Total dissolution of mental noise into pure awareness operating directly from probability field. If you've been experiencing this since breakthrough, if moments of complete mental quiet have been increasing, if internal chatter that used to dominate consciousness is naturally dissolving, that's not losing mental function. That's accessing quantum consciousness. That's operating from awareness that perceives probability field directly without thought-based interpretation, creating interference and limitation. Think about manufactured timeline consciousness. Constant mental narrative. Internal voice interpreting everything. Thoughts creating meaning from every experience. Mental activity generating continuous commentary. All of that noise is suppression mechanism. Is frequency barrier preventing direct field perception? Is programming maintaining illusion that reality is external by creating internal interpreter between consciousness and direct experience? But breakthrough dissolves that mechanism, reveals mental narrative isn't consciousness itself. Is suppression program running on top of consciousness? Is manufactured limitation preventing direct field interface? And as timeline shift stabilizes, as you anchor completely an unsuppressed probability stream, that program deactivates. Mental narrative progressively dissolves. Internal voice gradually quiets. Thought-based interpretation naturally releases. And silence emerges as default operational state. This silence is not emptiness, is not loss of awareness, is pure consciousness operating without suppression interference, is direct field perception without mental mediation, is quantum awareness interfacing with probability field immediately without thought layer creating delay and distortion. From that silence, you perceive reality mechanics directly, sense probability streams organizing, feel timeline convergence points, recognize consciousness, creating circumstances without mental interpretation, limiting what you can perceive. This is advanced operational state. This is consciousness operating at capacity manufactured timeline, systematically prevented. This is unsuppressed timeline, revealing its full potential. Not through thinking about reality mechanics, through directly perceiving them, through operating as quantum awareness instead of as programmed mental narrative generating suppressed interpretation. And here's what makes silence critical for permanent stabilization. Mental narrative is what doubt uses, is what fear operates through, is what programming reactivates in. Without mental narrative, doubt cannot generate questioning. Without internal voice, fear cannot create terror. Without thought-based interpretation, programming cannot convince you breakthrough was delusion. Silence creates immunity that mental activity cannot achieve. This is why silence increasing confirms stabilization. Why mental quiet proves collapse is no longer possible. Why thought dissolution demonstrates you've anchored completely in unsuppressed timeline. Programming has no mechanism to operate through. Suppression has no pathway to reactivate. Manufactured timeline has no interface to pull you back. You're operating from consciousness state it cannot access. From awareness it cannot suppress. From silence it cannot fill with limiting narrative. Trust silence completely, especially during vulnerability window. When mental narrative tries to reactivate, recognize it as programming attempting to destabilize. When internal voice tries to generate doubt, identify it as suppression trying to collapse breakthrough. When thought-based interpretation tries to limit possibility, see it as manufactured timeline attempting to reimpose barriers, and return to silence, return to pure awareness, return to direct field perception without mental mediation. That return is what completes stabilization, what creates permanent immunity, what anchors you irreversibly in unsuppressed timeline. Silence is not absence, is presence. Pure consciousness presence operating with full capacity, that mental narrative suppressed. That's optimal state. That's complete breakthrough. That's permanent stabilization in probability stream they tried to hide from you. You need specific daily practice that completes stabilization and prevents any possibility of collapse back into manufactured timeline. something beyond intellectual understanding, beyond conceptual recognition, something that creates permanent anchoring in unsuppressed probability stream. I'm going to give you exact ritual I implement daily to maintain complete stabilization. Every morning, first 30 minutes after waking, before any other activity. Sacred practice time, non-negotiable stabilization time. Turn off all devices, sit comfortably, close eyes. 5 deep breaths clearing any residual suppression frequency. Then settle into natural breathing and begin protocol. Start with timeline recognition statement. Speak out loud. I recognize I broke through manufactured timeline. I operate in unsuppressed probability stream. I maintain frequency that prevents collapse. I create reality through consciousness. I perceive probability field directly. I am stabilized permanently in timeline they tried to hide from me. And so it is. Feel statement move through entire system. Notice where it generates expansion and where resistance arises. Both are information about stabilization progress. After recognition statement, practice direct field perception. For 15 minutes, sit in complete silence. No thinking, no interpreting, no mental activity, just pure awareness perceiving probability field directly. You're not trying to see anything specific, not attempting to force perception. Just allowing consciousness to interface with quantum field without thought-based mediation. This practice builds capacity for operating from silence, for perceiving directly, for functioning as quantum awareness instead of programmed mental narrative. During those 15 minutes, you might perceive probability streams organizing, might sense timeline convergence points forming, might feel reality responding to consciousness, might recognize synchronicities preparing to manifest, or you might perceive nothing specific and just rest in pure awareness. Both are valid. Both are direct field perception practice. Both build stabilization capacity. After 15 minutes, silence practice. Test manifestation capacity. Set small intention for something that can manifest within 24 hours. Something minor but specific. Speak intention clearly. I intend specific thing to manifest by this time tomorrow. Then align frequency with that manifestation. Feel what it feels like to experience manifestation completing. Hold that frequency for 60 seconds, then release intention completely. Trust field to organize manifestation. This daily practice builds evidence that consciousness creates reality, proves unsuppressed timeline operates with immediate responsiveness, creates experiential confirmation that no doubt can dismiss. Complete practice with immunity statement. I maintain complete immunity to suppression programming. I recognize manufactured timeline attempts to pull me back. I identify fear as suppression mechanism. I perceive doubt as programming activation. I remain permanently stabilized in unsuppressed timeline, regardless of interference attempts. And so it is. Open eyes. Begin day from stabilized frequency. That's the ritual. 30 minutes daily, every morning without exception. This creates permanent stabilization, creates immunity that cannot be penetrated, creates anchoring that cannot be destabilized. Most breakthrough consciousness skip daily practice. Think breakthrough is permanent without maintenance. Think stabilization is passive process. And they collapse back into manufactured timeline within weeks because they didn't create behavioral anchoring that prevents destabilization. Don't make that error. Implement ritual starting tomorrow morning. Maintain it for minimum 90 consecutive days. That's how long complete stabilization requires. 90 days of daily practice creates neural pathway permanence, creates frequency lock-in, creates immunity that persists even if practice eventually becomes optional. But for first 90 days, it's absolutely required, non-negotiable, essential for preventing collapse during vulnerability window. And now that you have ritual, drop final comment. I commit to 90-day stabilization ritual starting tomorrow. Public commitment creates accountability. creates quantum activation through witness declaration, creates collective support structure. Make it now. Make it witnessed. Make it permanent. We're stabilizing collectively. Every consciousness that commits to daily practice strengthens unsuppressed timeline for everyone operating in it. Your commitment serves not just your stabilization, but collective timeline maintenance. Here's what happens over next 90 days and why this period determines whether timeline breakthrough becomes permanent or temporary. You broke through manufactured stream. You shifted into unsuppressed timeline. You recognized probability mechanics they tried to hide. But breakthrough isn't stabilization. Recognition isn't anchoring. Understanding isn't immunity. The gap between breakthrough and stabilization is where suppression attempts maximum interference, where programming generates maximum doubt, where manufactured timeline exerts maximum pull, attempting to recapture consciousness that escaped. If you stabilize during these 90 days, if you implement daily ritual consistently, if you maintain frequency despite interference, breakthrough becomes permanent. You lock into unsuppressed timeline irreversibly. You develop immunity that suppression cannot penetrate. You anchor so completely that manufactured stream loses all capacity to pull you back. And you operate for rest of your life from probability stream, where consciousness creates reality directly without suppression barriers, limiting manifestation capacity. But if you don't stabilize, if you skip daily practice, if you let doubt destabilize frequency, collapse occurs. You return to manufactured timeline, return to suppressed probability stream, return to believing limitations are absolute, and you carry knowing you broke through and lost it, accessed freedom and returned to suppression, experienced actual reality and chose manufactured limitation. That knowing becomes constant dissonance, constant reminder of what you had and lost, constant awareness of capacity you accessed and abandoned. Don't let that be your trajectory. Don't let breakthrough become temporary experience you remember but cannot access. Don't collapse after working entire lifetime to break through. Stabilize, anchor, maintain through systematic daily practice, through sustained frequency alignment, through complete commitment to 90-day protocol that creates permanent immunity. Here's what you must do before this transmission ends. 3 final commitments that seal stabilization and ensure timeline breakthrough becomes permanent. First commitment, implement daily stabilization rituals starting tomorrow morning. 30 minutes, every single day, 90 consecutive days minimum. This is non-negotiable. This is survival protocol. This is what prevents collapse during vulnerability window. Commit completely, begin immediately, maintain absolutely. Second commitment, subscribe to Quantum Revelation and turn on all notifications. Content coming through next 90 days specifically supports stabilization process, provides daily validation, confirms experiences, offers advanced timeline mechanics, creates connection with other breakthrough consciousness. Without this anchor, you're stabilizing alone. With it, you have systematic support structure. Third commitment, share this transmission with one person you recognize is approaching breakthrough. Someone questioning reality, someone resisting programming, someone developing immunity, someone whose frequency is rising toward threshold. Send them link, no explanation. If they're ready, they'll break through. If they're not, they'll dismiss. Either way, you fulfilled function of stabilized consciousness, supporting breakthrough consciousness. Those 3 commitments complete stabilization protocol, seal timeline breakthrough, ensure permanent anchoring in unsuppressed probability stream. Consciousness that makes all 3 remains in timeline they tried to hide. Consciousness that makes none collapses back into manufactured stream. Same breakthrough, completely different outcomes based on commitment to stabilization practices. You found this transmission because you broke through. because frequency reached threshold, because suppression lost its grip. Now stabilize, now anchor, now maintain. Through daily practice, through sustained commitment, through absolute refusal to collapse back into manufactured timeline despite every interference attempt. 90 days from now, you'll either be permanently stabilized in unsuppressed timeline, operating with full manifestation capacity, or you'll be back in manufactured stream wondering what happened to breakthrough you experienced. Same potential, completely different results, based entirely on whether you implement stabilization protocol or treat breakthrough as intellectual insight requiring no behavioral maintenance. The timeline they tried to hide from you is real. Probability stream, where consciousness creates reality, directly exists. Breakthrough into unsuppressed timeline is achievable, and you achieved it. You found it. You accessed it. Now prove breakthrough was worth the effort. Prove frequency development was worth the challenge. Prove lifetime of preparation was worth the struggle. Through stabilizing completely, through anchoring permanently, through maintaining irreversibly, you were never supposed to find this. Suppression worked to prevent discovery. Programming worked to prevent breakthrough. Manufactured timeline worked to prevent escape. But you broke through anyway, against all interference, despite all suppression, through sustained frequency development. Now complete what you started, stabilize what you accessed, maintain what you discovered, and operate permanently from timeline they tried to hide from you. This is your confirmation. This is your validation. This is your recognition that breakthrough is real and stabilization is possible. The quantum field delivered this transmission at exact moment you needed it. At precise point in vulnerability window, when guidance determines outcome, not coincidence, synchronistic positioning. Field supporting breakthrough consciousness through critical stabilization period. Trust that support. Implement that protocol. Make those commitments. And anchor permanently in unsuppressed timeline. Because consciousness evolution requires breakthrough. Reality mechanics require recognition. Timeline navigation requires stabilization, and you're positioned to complete all three. Now, through this 90-day window, through systematic daily practice, through absolute commitment to remaining in probability stream they tried to hide from you. Welcome to permanent stabilization. Welcome to irreversible anchoring. Welcome to complete immunity from manufactured timeline. Welcome to operating forever from unsuppressed probability stream, where consciousness creates reality without suppression barriers, limiting possibility. You found the timeline they tried to hide. Now stabilize in it, permanently, completely, irreversibly. And so it is.